Welcome and thank you for watching this recorded webinar. Before we get started, I want to remind folks who need continuing education credit that you must register and purchase to take the post-test exam. You must pass with a score of 75% or higher, and you will be given 3 attempts to pass. Once you pass, a CE certificate will be automatically emailed to you. We also ask that you kindly complete a course evaluation. Links to the post-test and course evaluation are available in the show notes. Now, I'd like to extend a warm welcome and introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Monica Williams. She is a board-certified licensed clinical psychologist and professor at the University of Ottawa in the School of Psychology, where she is the Canada Research Chair in Mental Health Disparities. She is also the clinical director of the Behavioral Wellness Clinic in Connecticut and Ontario, where she provides supervision and training to clinicians for empirically supported treatments. Dr. Williams' research focuses on African American mental health, culture, and psychopathology, and she has published over 100 scientific articles on these topics. She also gives diversity trainings nationally for clinical psychology programs, scientific conferences, and community organizations. She serves as an associate editor of behavioral therapy and is on the editorial board of several additional journals. She is a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the International OCD Foundation and co-founded their Diversity Council. Her work has been featured in all major US and Canadian media outlets, including NPR, CBC, Huffington Post, and the New York Times. So without further ado, Dr. Williams will be speaking with us about culturally informed clinical research.
All right, I'd just like to say that, I do a lot of different things, but primarily I consider myself a researcher, and I love talking about research. And even more than that, I like talking about culturally informed research, which, sometimes can make, friends and family's eyes glaze over, if you talk about that too much. But I'm so happy that I have a whole group of people who I just assume love the topic as much as I do. So we're gonna dive in. I just want to also say that this information and this presentation are based on research findings, including my own work and other researchers, and don't speak to the position of the Multicultural Counseling Institute or its programming or instructors. And in terms of positionality, I'm an African American woman living in Canada, where I'm a permanent resident, and I have no conflicts of interest to report. So here's an overview of what we're going to discuss today, and I won't go into depth in any of this now because we're gonna go in depth in all of this. But just as an overview, by the end of the presentation, hopefully you'll be able to talk about the ethical importance of diversity in mental health research, identify barriers to inclusion of minoritized groups, describe research abuses against racialized groups, list key areas in research studies where problematic biases may arise, implement key methods for effective outreach to diverse participants, and implement processes for retaining diverse participants. So let's dive right in by talking about the ethics of inclusion, right? Why is that an ethical concern? And that goes back to, and that has to do with representation and diversity. Now, for a long time, researchers really didn't think much about inclusion in their research studies. And it wasn't until actually 1987 when the National Institutes of Health urged that researchers would include women in their NIH-funded clinical research, because there was a growing understanding that research findings tended to be more applicable to men because women were excluded for all sorts of things like, can you believe it, like having menstrual cycles, because that was like, oh, that could interfere with our data, which of course was a problem because then the research results that came from the research, well, they may or may not apply to women, right? So they encouraged researchers to start including women. And then within 2 years, they passed the NIH Revitalization Act, which went into effect in 1993, where they encouraged that ethnic and racial minorities be included as well. And then this was effective in 1994, where it was actually required that they report on ethnic and racial minorities in clinical research, and refused to fund any study that didn't comply. So this was a big step, basically acknowledging that women and people of color and subpopulations need to be included in all clinical research, and they needed to be included in phase 3 trials in adequate numbers to allow for valid analyses of any differences in intervention effects, which may require, in some cases, oversampling some groups. And cost was not considered an allowable reason for excluding these groups. And so again, this was a pretty big milestone, and it really made a lot of researchers think differently about how they needed to conduct their studies if they were going to be inclusive. Now, as to how well this worked, we'll talk about that. But in terms of inclusion, the Department of Health and Human Services determined that it's basically said it's imperative to determine whether the intervention or therapy being studied affects women or men or members of minority groups and their subpopulations differently, right? So this is speaking to the issue, again, of generalization, because if you conduct a study, let's say it's only white people, well, how do you know that it applies to people of color? And for the most part, you don't. So in other words, there are a lot of practical issues because treatments may affect different groups differently for a variety of reasons. Which they may include physiological reasons, for example, medication studies, but there are also a number of cultural reasons too. For example, people in different cultural groups may express their psychopathology differently. They may have different explanations for the causes of mental health issues, and they may find some treatments or interventions more acceptable or less acceptable than others, which will then have an impact on expectancy, adherence, and outcome for those studies. Because if you have an intervention and you explain, well, the reason that you're depressed is because you're having, these maladaptive or unrealistic or unhelpful thoughts about a situation, right? That I might say that as a cognitive behavioral practitioner, but if the person on the other end doesn't think any of that makes sense, or they don't believe it, and they think that they're having problems because of something they ate or something in the air or spiritual issues, well, then your explanation and your treatment is not going to land. So they're not going to be so it's unlikely that treatment's going to be very effective. And so again, why is this an ethical issue? And so I want to take us back to the Belmont report, which was really also in a lot of ways a landmark achievement. This was published by the U.S. Department of Health in 1979, that talked about 3 fundamental ethical principles that need to be sort of the unifying principles that form the basis for inclusion of human subjects in research. And these 3 ethical principles are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Now, the principle of respect for others states that individuals should be treated as if they are autonomous, unless they're found to be otherwise. And so this includes taking into consideration that each autonomous person has their own opinions and their own choices, and they should not be excluded unless they need protection. And so excluding people of color who are not in need of protection violates the principle of respect for persons. And so while people of color may be protected from potential harm by excluding them, they may also be being deprived of potential benefit. Now, in addition, the principle of beneficence states that treating a person ethically involves maximizing benefits, preventing harm, and making efforts to secure their well-being. And so certainly if people are coerced into participation in a project that harms them, well, this would not illustrate the principle of beneficence. And then in terms of justice, the principles outline the idea that the benefits and burdens of research should be fairly distributed. So in other words, all racial and ethnic groups need to share equally in the benefits of participation of research studies, and they need to equally share in the risks and burdens of participation in research studies. And also, all taxpayers fund research that is funded by the federal government, and so the findings should be applicable to all groups. And research findings that are not inclusive of people of color may mainly benefit the majority who are being researched, because then the treatment approaches become tailored based on their results. So we have to figure out what works best for different groups. Okay, and I'm going to give you some, and so you may be thinking, oh, well, this is so fantastic that the government laid down the hammer here, and now we have research that is inclusive of everyone. And that would certainly be a wonderful utopian thing to imagine. However, this has actually not been the case, because there hasn't really been a lot of enforcement in terms of outcomes of study. So researchers have to talk in their research proposals about how they will be inclusive of people of color. But you know what? If they fail to do that, actually nothing happens to them. So as a result, we had a surge in inclusion at first, but now we find that that there isn't really as much impetus for researchers to include people in different groups, especially if it's going to take more time, effort, or money. And of course, anything worth doing does take time, effort, and money. And I'm going to give you some examples from my own research of some of the problems that we see from this. And this first one is a paper that we published recently, where we did a systematic review of inclusion of minoritized populations in randomized controlled trials of acceptance and commitment therapy, also known as ACT. And so we looked at over 75 ACT RCTs. So these are randomized controlled trials that were performed in the United States with a total population of over 10,000, almost 11,000 participants. And what we found, and we also looked at other factors too, such as sexual orientation and gender. And what we found was that many studies didn't even include this information, so they couldn't even be counted in this study. And so several studies were not included in the study. But one of the things that you can see here, if you look at this table in terms of who was included in the studies, the orange bar represents the US population, and the yellow bar is what we found in our study sample. And so if you look at it, the white people were overrepresented a little bit. Black people, white people were underrepresented a little bit. Black people were underrepresented a little bit. But look at the Latin American population was vastly underrepresented in these research studies. And so imagine you're a clinician and you want to use ACT with, a client of color who, may be, let's say they're Mexican American. Well, you don't really have much data you don't have much of a basis to know whether or not that treatment is going to be effective for people in that group, because look at the large exclusion of that demographic in the research that's been done. And likewise, we did another study where we looked at the inclusion of people of color in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy worldwide. And what we found there also there were some big discrepancies. So we found that 82% were non-Hispanic white, only 2%, 2.5% were Black, or in this case, African American. 2% were listed of Latin origin, and we had a little bit more people of indigenous origin because there were a few studies that were just focused on those groups. But also there were several studies that didn't report any findings, and so we have like a huge number that were unknown, and a number of studies we couldn't even include because they didn't provide that data. And so again, what we see here is for these types of studies, which is one of my areas of research, to date, almost all white people have been part of these studies, both as participants, but also as researchers. And so that brings us to the question of the day, right? How do we increase inclusion of underrepresented ethnic and racial groups in our research studies? And inclusion, and I talk about inclusion broadly, so not just recruiting them, but also retaining them in the studies as well, and having good follow-up data, and making sure that their experience is as good as the experiences of everyone else in the study. Okay, so what are some of the barriers to inclusion? One of them is medical mistrust. And so we know from the research that people of color often underutilize healthcare services out of fear of mistreatment, and particularly in terms of mental health, being afraid of being hospitalized involuntarily or being used as guinea pigs for research. And there's been some research really focusing on African Americans, and unfortunately there hasn't been as much focused on other ethnic and racial groups, but African Americans for sure seem to have a greater distrust of the medical establishment and of mental health care, many believing that medical institutions hold racist attitudes. I mean, which, because we live in a racist society, they absolutely do. So they're not wrong. And these negative perceptions also may go all the way back to historical abuses of slaves who were often used for research experiments, and also US government sanctioned abuses of people of color, such as the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, which we'll talk more about. So hopefully most of you have heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study, but I'm gonna review it here because it is such a blatant and stark indicator of how bad things can get and of why many people may be fearful of research studies even to this day. So the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the African American male, and that's the official title of the study, is the longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings in medical history. So it started in 1932 by the United States Public Health Service, and it was purportedly designed to examine the natural course of untreated syphilis in some 400 African American men in Tuskegee, Alabama. Now, the research participants all had syphilis when they were enrolled in the study, and they were matched against 200 uninfected subjects who served as a control group. The subjects were recruited with misleading promises of special free treatment, which were actually very painful spinal taps done without anesthesia to study the neurological effects of syphilis. And the participants were enrolled without their informed consent. And then when it became clear, a decade later, that penicillin was a safe and effective treatment for the disease, they were not given penicillin, and in fact, they were denied penicillin, and in some cases, a few of them started to get a little suspicious that they weren't being treated right, and went to other clinics, and even at those other clinics, they were denied treatment because there was a buzz in the medical community. No, these are the patients in that study. Don't treat them. So there was actually interference by the US Public Health Service for them to actually get help for their syphilis. And as a result, over 100 died directly from advanced syphilis. And this included sometimes the men's wives and children who were infected in that way. And so in August, not until August 1972, and this was due because a reporter burst the story. An investigatory panel found that the study was ethically unjustified and that penicillin should have been provided to everyone. And then the National Research Act passed in 1974 that mandated that all federally funded proposed research with human subjects had to be approved by an institutional review board or an IRB. Now, those of you who do research, believe me, I empathize. The IRB can be a big pain in terms of getting your studies approved. And sometimes we roll our eyes like, really? But there's a good reason for the IRB, and that is because before that, it was really the Wild West, and you could kind of do what you wanted to people in the name of science, which just wasn't cool. And so in 1992, settlement payments of about $40,000 were made to survivors, and President Clinton in 1997 publicly apologized on behalf of the federal government to a handful of study survivors and their families. And so that was a very dark chapter in American history, so to speak. And if that was the only chapter like that, we could say maybe that was an anomaly. But the fact of the matter is, this wasn't the only research abuse that people of color were subjected to. This same group that did the Tuskegee syphilis study, they just went to Guatemala and they just did the same thing with people in Guatemala. And in fact, in those cases, sometimes participants were intentionally infected with syphilis so that they could study the progression of the disease. And I know sometimes people argue like, oh, those researchers in Tuskegee, they intentionally infected the Black men, and other people are like, no, they didn't. And what I want to say is, it kind of doesn't matter, because really we know they weren't above it, and the fact that they withheld the treatment was just as bad. So I don't even think that's anything worth arguing over, because it was just bad all around. And if we were to discover that they did intentionally infect somebody or some people, or maybe all of them, I wouldn't even be surprised, because they did that in Guatemala. And so there were, this experiment was discovered by a professor at Wellesley College when she was looking through some research notes left by a researcher, John Charles Cutler, a public health service sexual disease specialist who headed the experiment. She found these after his death in 2003. And he and his fellow researchers enrolled soldiers, mental health patients, prostitutes, convicts, and others in Guatemala for the study. So former President Barack Obama apologized for these experiments in 2010. And Hillary Clinton described the experiments as clearly unethical. Despite this lawsuit that was filed that a judge said could proceed in 2019, later on, a district court ruled in 2022 in favor of the defendants, saying that the doctor and his colleagues were not acting on behalf of their sponsors, which was the Rockefeller Foundation or the employees of Johns Hopkins, and these institutions had not aided or abetted any violations of the law, and so this did not proceed. So no justice for these individuals in Guatemala. And again, but that's not all. I have more interesting and sad examples for you. And I don't know if you've heard of a project called MK Ultra that was launched after World War II during the Cold War era in order to study mind control techniques, because there was this fear that the Soviets had developed mind control technologies, because some Americans were defecting to the Soviet Union, and they thought, well, why would anyone defect except that their mind's being controlled? So therefore they must have mind control drugs. So we have to figure out what these are. And so they started this study called MK Ultra, where they pumped money into disguised as federal grants to many different institutions to study the properties of LSD as a mind control drug. And so hundreds of people were given LSD, many without their knowledge or consent. And the subjects in the studies included Americans, Canadians, and people internationally. And one hotbed of research study was this spot at in Kentucky, actually, in Lexington, Kentucky, called the Addictions. It was the Addictions Research Center, affectionately referred to as Narco Farm. And research was done there, and there was also research sites in other places like Cold Spring Harbor in New York. And if you even like read some of the research studies that were done, for example, there's one in 1963 that was published. And so I should remind you that these abuses did not happen in secret. The researchers were regularly publishing their findings in top journals. And this was even true with the Tuskegee study. Researchers, people in the research world, they knew the study was being done, and nobody was like, hey, that's unethical. Same thing with this. They were publishing their studies. And I quote from one of the journal articles, the Cold Spring Harbor subjects were the 5 non-psychotic white subjects used for the past 5 years in intra-subject studies. They were an engineer, a physician, a lawyer, a teacher, and a housewife. At Lexington, the subjects were all Negro male drug addicts serving for violation of the narcotic laws. They were in good physical health with no evidence of major psychosis. And so both of those groups were given LSD. And I don't know, you can imagine that there's a very different environment that these participants are getting this drug in, right? So at Cold Spring Harbor, the experiments were conducted in the home of a writer, in the home of the PI, under social conditions, quote unquote, designed to reduce anxiety. Whereas in Lexington, they were conducted in a special ward devoted to research. And I don't have pictures of what that ward looked like, but I'm thinking like cinder blocks in a metal chair. But in any case, knowing the importance of set and setting in psychedelic experiences, which we're going to talk more about, I can assure you that these groups were not comparable and did not have the same experience. And yet this is what was published in 1963 as quote unquote science. Later on, there were some congressional hearings about what had happened during this time during MK Ultra. And one of the Edward Flowers, who's an African-American man who had participated in these experiments in the early 50s, basically is quoted as saying, they used my ass and took advantage of me, you know, being a young kid and all the rest of that kind of stuff. Back then, at that time, for a while, I was angry and bitter. And the narco farm, eventually, when it became difficult because of some of the changes we talked about to use inmates as research participants, they folded and moved to, I believe, Bethesda, where they became NIDA. And to this day, I'm not aware that any kind of apology has been published, but rather the ARC is kind of upheld as a sort of this place where they did all this wonderful research, even though most of it was considered unethical by today's standards. And that citation there, Strauss et al., that's our research team. We studied those studies and found the vast majority of them had multiple ethical violations. Okay. And then we have even some studies more recent than that. You might have heard of the South Dakota vaccine experiment. And in this experiment, newborn Lakota Sioux Native American babies were injected with either an experimental hepatitis type A vaccine or an approved hepatitis type B vaccine as a control. These babies were selected because on many reservations, being poor, rural, and crowded, they had epidemics of hepatitis A every 5 to 7 years. An epidemic in 1990 and 1991 infected more than 500 people and resulted in numerous hospitalizations and deaths. And so the goal of the program was to inject about 105 babies, and after studying the results, offer the vaccine to everyone. Does anybody see anything wrong with this approach? So the Indian Health Service officials who assumed responsibilities for the trials stated that the Indians as a group stood to benefit from hepatitis A vaccine. However, in a letter to doctors, the healthcare service warned of anaphylactic reactions and possible side effects such as cancer, jaundice, and death. So anyway, none of those possibilities were explained to the families, who later filed a lawsuit and said, look, they were not told of these risks when permission to vaccinate their babies was sought, and they believed the experiments were racist and deceptive. And so, so again, this is just one more reason why so many Native Americans still regard the federal government with a fair bit of suspicion. Because if this vaccine was potentially beneficial to everyone, it should have been given to all babies, not just Native American babies, right? So that is a really questionable approach, even though, of course, the researchers said they had good intentions. Now I'm in Canada, and I always get a few Canadians who think that we don't have the same issues here, but we do. And I'm going to talk briefly just about the Canadian malnutrition experiment that was done on Indigenous children. So these highly unethical nutrition experiments were performed on Indigenous children at 6 different residential schools between 1942 and 1952 by the Department of Indian Affairs in Canada under the direction of 2 physicians. One was a famed nutritionist, and then also several pediatricians at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, who had developed pablum infant cereal in the 1930s. Now, in these experiments, the parents were not informed, nor were consents obtained. Even as children died from the experiments, they continued. So in these experiments, control and treatment groups of malnourished children were denied adequate nutrition. In one experiment, the treatment group received supplements of riboflavin, thiamine, and or ascorbic acid supplements to determine whether these mitigated the problems. They didn't. In other children, they were given a flour mix containing added thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and bone meal. Rather than improving nutrition, the children became more anemic, likely contributing to more deaths and certainly impacting their development. And in these experiments, efforts were made to control as many factors as possible, even when they harmed the research participants. For example, previously available dental care was denied in some settings because the researchers wanted to observe the state of dental caries and gingivitis with malnutrition. And so, you may remember that in the Tuskegee experiments, these were natural observations that continued long after penicillin became available to treat syphilis. But in this case, the basics of alleviating malnutrition, which everybody knows is just giving people food, were well known even before the experiments began. So both studies were performed on people who were already marginalized, but no one was looking out for the best interest of the research participants, and they had no voice. And then I guess the last one I'll mention is the Johns Hopkins lead paint study, which started in the 90s when Kennedy Krieger researchers encouraged or required landlords to rent lead-contaminated apartments to families with young children, and these were primarily, poor Black families. And the federal EPA and HUD provided funds amounting to more than $1 million to test different methods of lead paint abatement to see if that worked. So basically, some of the homes had peeling lead paint and others had peeling lead paint, and the families were just told to brush this stuff over the walls, and then we'll see if that helps. And so the level of lead that accumulated in the children's blood determined the success of the various methods. And we all know that exposure to lead has a detrimental effect on health and cognitive development in children. But somehow I don't even know how this got through the IRB, but there was a lawsuit later, and the judge had said that basically the children were being used as measuring tools by researchers, and they were basically canaries in the mine, and the court likened the study to the infamous Tuskegee experiment. And so that was, another example of something that really didn't happen that long ago, and And believe me, that was not the last unethical research study that was ever done.
Well, why don't we pause here for some questions? We have time for maybe one or two questions. If you can go ahead and type it into the chat screen, and then I'll read it out loud. Um, and Dr. Williams, thanks for going over some of these studies that happened in Canada. I actually was not aware of the one from 1990. That's so recent. Can't believe that
Yeah.
that's happening. Yeah, yeah. So if y'all have any questions right now, go ahead and type it into the chat screen. We'll have time for maybe one or two questions.
Yeah, and and I hear frequently about studies, even current studies, most of them not this egregious, thank goodness, but some that you just scratch your head and you're like, how did anyone think that that was ethical at all? And unfortunately, people do still experience harm.
So we do have a question. I'm so glad you're talking about the lack of inclusion. One minority group that often is ignored is people with disabilities. How can we improve upon this?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And, we're really focused today on ethnic and racial discrimination and cultural inclusion or exclusion. And so I could feel like that could be like a whole nother research topic. But one of the things we're going to talk about is the importance of including the people you're studying, as part of your research team, so that so that you're so that you have a more full, I mean, this doesn't guarantee that that's going to fix every problem, but I think that's be the starting point, right? Because you can't just come in and, with this savior mentality to a group that you're not part of and say, we're going to study you. And then we're going to tell you what's good for you, right? So that's not a good way to serve any marginalized community.
Okay, so why don't we go ahead and move on, and then probably around another 20 minutes, we'll have time for some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. Um, And yeah, because there's so many different marginalized groups that do suffer from research abuses. And so I think it's important that we keep that in mind. And I think hopefully a lot of the things we talk about today will also apply to some of these other groups as well. Now, and so anyways, a result of many things, including the history of research abuses that I went over, there is a cultural memory of these historical abuses, even if for some groups, maybe they don't even necessarily know the names of these abusive studies, but they may have a sense that, some abuses were done, like to our people, and maybe I should pay attention to that. And one way that this has been explained is by Whaley. He calls it healthy Black paranoia for Black people who are wary of everything. And it's a response style based on experiences of racism and oppression in US society. But it's not just about these historical events, it's also about everyday experiences of discrimination. Um, getting health care can be very difficult, painful, exhausting for people of color. I mean, I don't know, I could raise my hand here, because you don't know if the doctor is going to take you seriously as a person of color, and they're going to be dismissive, or they're going to actually act on your problem, or if they're going to be acting in your best interest, right? And so having to wonder about whether the doctor is going to be acting in your best interest because of your identity, that's like not something you should have to wonder about when you have an illness. So there are also other biases to participation as well. And so medical researchers may exclude people of color due to assumptions about their fitness as participants. So there may be some thoughts, oh, well, they won't be good research participants. Or they may be excluded due to biased recruitment methods. And this was something that I saw a lot in the research that I conducted when I was at the University of Pennsylvania, where there were research studies going on for OCD, for example, and almost all of the participants were white. But at the same time, we were doing studies for PTSD, and almost all of those participants were Black. And without going into detail, I will tell you, this was not an accident, but it was 100% the way we were recruiting our participants. And so this can be a problem. And also researchers may selectively include or exclude people that they think, again, are going to be good candidates just and because they're bringing their own biases and stereotypes with them into work. And so these problems cause mental health disparities, mental health care disparities. And I will just quickly go over this chart, which shows a couple different routes to racial disparities in mental health. So you have like persistent discrimination, which in and of itself is a risk factor because it causes physiological and psychological stress. And that's one reason we have differences in mental health. But there's also bias on the part of clinicians, implicit biases, which result in disparities in decision-making. In other words, they're misdiagnosing people based on their own stereotypes, which results in racial mental health care disparities. And these health care disparities result in mental health disparities. And then we also have clinician implicit biases resulting in disparities in clinical communication, right? So research shows that the way clinicians communicate with their patients varies based on race and varies based on the implicit bias of the provider. And so if patients feel like they're being talked down to, or they're not being taken seriously, or they're being patronized, well, they have a negative reaction. And so they're going to be less likely to come back for follow-up care, or less likely to be adherent to treatment recommendations, and then more likely to have disparities in their health. And these same problems we also see in research, and we're going to talk about those. I'm going to give an example. I'm going to illustrate some of these issues in a study that we did of at a study of MDMA for racial trauma. And it was actually MDMA for PTSD, but some of the PTSD, because we were focused on people of color, was caused by racial trauma. So we developed a research site. This was when I was at the University of Connecticut, specifically to create a positive cultural experience for people of color to be part of this study. And so this study was sponsored by the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And they wanted to see if MDMA, which has a really long name that I'm not going to say, but people call ecstasy on the street, but ecstasy and MDMA are not the same because you don't know what's in ecstasy. This is pure MDMA. And with MDMA assisted therapy, could this resolve PTSD? And so they were moving into phase 3 trials with clinical sites in the US, Canada, and Israel. And research to date had shown that MDMA can augment psychotherapeutic work to help improve symptoms of PTSD, that it's only taken 2 or 3 times in the course of the treatment process, which is mostly therapy. But it reduces fear by reducing fear of traumatic memories, making them easier to access, improving autobiographical recall, increasing feelings of trust and compassion and connection with the therapist, which also improves rapport and the treatment process. And so because of the promising research to date, the FDA granted MDMA breakthrough status, believing that it could have an advantage over existing medications for PTSD and would expedite a review process for new drug applications for MDMA. And so, however, there were some problems because at MAPS, they realized that like their phase 2 trials had almost no people of color, like maybe one Black person, right? One Asian person, almost none. And the FDA is like, well, hey, how generalizable is this treatment to people of color? And so because I showed you that the findings of our review of the literature, again, people of color are severely underrepresented. However, they tend to experience the highest rates of PTSD, often because of problems like systemic racism and poverty. And this leads to prolonged suffering, disability, and poor quality of life. And so the lack of inclusion in MDMA-assisted psychotherapy studies means we don't know if the treatment is appropriate, safe, or effective for people of color. And also, if it is, then they haven't been able to access these potential therapeutic benefits, also creating an ethical concern. And so we decided at our, this was when I was at University of Connecticut, we would do a site just for people of color. And this was called MP16. This was sort of the lead up to the phase 3 trial under the guidance of the FDA at the health center. And we were the only, and of all of the sites in the study, ours was the only one focused on people of color. And we really wanted to go above and beyond the study protocol to emphasize culturally sensitive and respectful treatment approaches to people of diverse backgrounds. So let me tell you a little bit about the study. Inclusion criteria was that you had to have PTSD as per the DSM-5, and you'd be willing to comply with the study procedures. Exclusion criteria included excessive prior ecstasy use, psychotic disorders, eating disorders, few other disorders, or serious suicidal or homicidal risk. These are pretty standard exclusion criteria. And I won't go into the details of the protocol because it's long and complicated and we don't have enough time. But I just will put this up there to show you. These are all like the visits, everything from informed consent to independent online rater screening, enrollment, preparatory session, assessment, preparatory session. Then you get MDMA, and that's like an all-day session. And then they get integration, which is like follow-up, and they get phone calls, and they get more integration. And so you can see it's an involved procedure. The MDMA is like not a magic pill because there's so much therapy involved as well. And again, the study sponsors had problems enrolling people of color, and they didn't know why. And there was even some concern, would we be able to find people of color to do this study, right? So remember, here we are now, we're researchers, we've got this, I don't know, this rainbow colored pill that's gonna impair your senses, and you're gonna have to completely trust these researchers that are doing who knows what to your head. You think, well, gosh, are people of color gonna sign on for that, right? And so here are the steps that we had to take. First of all, the first step, number one, was, do we have a diverse treatment team, right? Because having clinicians from different ethnic groups improves the ability of the team as a whole to understand and appreciate the issues that are relevant to more potential participants. And so having adequate staff members from diverse groups is really so critical to important efforts at recruiting and retaining people of color, because again, remember, we've got lots of people of color feeling uncomfortable with the mental health system, and also in mental health fear that white therapists are not going to understand their experiences as racialized people and be able to support that experience. And so just having people of color on the team automatically, that's a potential safety signal for people of color that, oh, wait, they might, maybe they will understand in me. Maybe they will appreciate me. Maybe I won't have harm come to me if I participate in that study. So we intentionally made our team as diverse as possible. So I was the PI. So, as a Black woman, that really helped. We had a white male psychiatrist as the co-PI because I'm a psychologist. The FDA required that the co-PI be a prescriber. And we actually didn't have any choice in terms of the prescriber because the university hospital chose the prescriber and said that that person had to be one of the faculty of the psychiatry department, and the chair would choose that person. So we didn't have any say over that, but we had a lot of say over the rest of it. And the study coordinator was also an African-American female. We had one of the physicians was a Indian American, and we had 3 additional study therapists who are very diverse as well. And so this can make a huge difference in participation in terms of willingness and overall comfort, because when participants see other people like themselves invested in the research and having key leadership roles, it also makes the study more personally relevant. And so when interacting with our potential participants, many of them said to us how grateful they were that we were so diverse, and they expressed their gratitude, and they expressed that they felt safer and comfortable. And many of them were less worried about experiencing racism just because they saw people like themselves doing the work. Now, in terms of outreach and recruitment, the way that the participants were being recruited was they would see information posted on clinical trials registries, or they would get email announcements from MAPS, which was the sponsors. And that's how they would learn about it. And a lot of them were just flooding in to these sites to be included. But this was a very select group of people who already had a pre-existing interest in the study, or some connection with it, or with the psychedelic communities, which were mostly white. And so the information was not even getting out to communities of color. And this was what their ad looked like. This was the IRB approved ad for the study. And this ad was approved before we even jumped on the scene. And I looked at this ad and I'm like, yeah, no, this isn't going to work. And I don't know if you can look at this and think to yourself, why might this ad not be sufficient to recruit people of color for a study like this? And I will tell you why. This is because of the nature of the study, a different approach is going to be needed to build trust, to provide psychoeducation about something people may not have a lot of knowledge about, and some gentle encouragement. And this text did not address the concerns of people of color because they're worried about being abused and the safety of a new drug. And so minimal information could actually make people less trustful, because then they start to think, well, what are you hiding from me by giving so little information? And so we realized we would have to make a new recruitment material. And we wanted to be as transparent as possible to mitigate any potential suspicion people might feel. And so we really wanted to put front and center names and pictures of everybody in our study, show that we're diverse, that we're well qualified, and provide psychoeducation about the condition we're studying, which would include language about people's fears of death, disability, addiction, and language about our site's culturally sensitive approach. And so we also made these into flyers, which would be useful for posters on campus, on public transportation, handouts, web pages, email outreach. This is what we developed. You can see this is vastly different from that other ad, which had very minimal information. We have a picture of a person of color, right? This is the people we're trying to reach. Their concerns, things that might be contributing to traumatization, a little bit about symptoms they may be experiencing. And then our study information here, also addressing some of what we know their fears are from the literature. And pictures of our team, our beautiful team here at the bottom. See, aren't we all so fantastic looking? Yeah, so people will see that and they're like, oh, okay, these are real people, and they're talking to me. And so, and I have to also say that it was a process to get this approved, because the other ad was already approved to the IRB, and MAPS did not want to go back to the IRB and have to get a new material approved, because that was time, expense, and so forth. So this was a battle, in part because there wasn't a culturally informed expert on the front end when the study was designed saying, hey, maybe we want to think differently about this. So some of the things we had to fix after the fact, because nobody had thought about it before. Additionally, for our community outreach, well, you have to ask, who's your community? So in our case, the community was the university, the students, and also the local cities and towns. And so to reach the campus community, we gave some talks about people of color. And we gave a talk called just From Microaggressions to Hate Crimes, Racial Trauma is Real, where we talked about that subject. And then at the end said, and if you think you have trauma, or if you have trauma, we're doing this study, by the way. We also did another talk focused more on the psychedelic experience. So the participants, the researchers also, as part of their training experience, had MDMA themselves. So they were in a very good place to talk about the effect of this substance on the mind and on people of color. And so we had a talk on our experiences as subjects in a trial, and that kind of reached a different group. And so these were some ways that we reached out to the students, and we had other ways too of reaching the community through community talks, networking, and so forth. And we'll talk more about that too if we have time. Now, also was really important, compensate your participants, right? So at this study, the participants were not getting any compensation at all, no financial compensation. But people of color are more likely to be economically disadvantaged. And so participating in a study, and you saw all of what's involved in that, they're going to have to take time off of a job or school or from taking care of family or other responsibilities. And these can be an obstacle to participation. And so we wanted to make sure that we were compensating people at least enough to cover their losses, and ideally a little more to show our appreciation for their time and respect for what they're contributing to us. And I always find it interesting when researchers give me pushback on compensating participants, because if you actually usually look at the budget of the study, usually compensation is a very small piece. And so I think that it's it can be a real ethical problem if we're not compensating people appropriately. And so having incentives helps people who are low income or economically disadvantaged participate, but it's also for people who maybe aren't economically disadvantaged. It may help justify their participation, especially if they have to be away from their family. Their family may be like, why are you being away from the family? They could say, well, I'm getting some money out of it. And they're like, oh, okay. So sometimes that helps, right? Because people may not understand why it's worth their time. And so we were able to provide $400 to our participants, which was really helpful for many people. And since that time, more funds have been set aside in the larger study for people to be included. Now, that being said, I believe all participants should be fairly compensated as a matter of social justice. However, that being said, payments that are too large can amount to coercion, and so the appropriate amount should be carefully considered. Now, in terms of the screening process, clinicians had to get detailed information from participants by phone. And, and because of the population that we were seeking, we needed to take extra time to build trust and rapport in these meetings. And so the original study, they had it all figured out in terms of their budget, how much time each thing should take. And their phone screenings was like 15 minutes. And we were like, no, these are taking us an hour. And that was, again, because we needed to spend more time on the front end building trust and rapport, especially people of color who may not have felt respected or been given the same courtesy as white people in other situations. They need to see that, no, we're actually really doing that. Many ethnic groups like to know people before opening up. And also, they may have a lower mental health literacy due to greater cultural stigmas about mental health in those communities. So the study screening staff needed to provide some psychoeducation about symptoms as well to aid in determining eligibility, because sometimes the symptoms weren't even described in the same ways. Now, and so again, we had to deliberately take more time to build rapport and collect those details in order to meet our diversity goals. And that's actually a picture of one of the study rooms that we had. We had a fantastic view. And we tried to make it feel as homey as possible, even though it was a hospital room. We're like, what can we do? We'll talk more about that. Now, informed consent is critical, and I think all of us know that informed consent's not just a give you a form, sign it, one and done. It's an ongoing process. But in addition to that, sometimes people don't think about the fact that actually what's in the informed consent, what's in the form can be frightening and off-putting to some groups. And so we actually went through the consent form and identified a lot of words and phrases that were kind of triggering for people in different ethnic groups. And so, for example, just the term research in and of itself, and certainly we don't want to hide from anyone that we're doing a research study, but just that term can be triggering. And so we minimized the word research in favor of less triggering terms such as project and study to distance ourselves from association with these historical abuses. And also, for Latin people, the word investigation can be triggering to those who face immigration stigma. And so that similarly was reworded. The term experimental session for the MDMA visit was changed to overnight test session to eliminate terms that would make people question their safety. And we found this was a really good opportunity to provide education about psychedelic medicines and debunk myths that people might have had about it. The main concerns that we knew would be fears of death, disability, and mental disability and addiction. We were able to actually speak to that directly from the results of the phase 1 and 2 studies. And we could very confidently say we've had, there have been X hundred people in the study, nobody has died, nobody became addicted, and really give honest information to help people put the risks in perspective. And so it's important also to understand that, culture shapes outcomes. And so for psychedelic assisted studies, you have your treatment response, and there's a lot of factors. So there's the medication, and so some of that is going to be, so biology is going to have an effect because they're getting medication, and we have to, and in addition to things you usually think about, there's cultural issues as well, like diet variations and enzyme expression differences. Other things that affect treatment response is the setting. Where is it taking place, right? And that lighting, music, furniture, artwork, interior design, therapeutic relationship, right? And so culture, again, comes in there. You need culturally sensitive clinicians. What about your artwork? So do you have Black or Indigenous artwork? What about your choice of music, right? All culturally predicated. And then set, which refers to mindset. That includes beliefs, expectation, personality, intentions, preparation. Again, cultural piece there. Cultural, which can include social status, discrimination, spiritual beliefs, for example. So again, there's many factors that influence individual responses in this type of treatment, and really all kinds of treatments. And so if we break this down, when creating a comfortable space, what's a comfortable space differs by culture. And so we said, we're going to deliberately create a welcoming venue. And you have to think about it. It's not automatic, because there's pervasive racist messages that are embedded in our social structures. For example, environmental microaggressions, right? Things to consider: a lack of diversity in the artwork, reading material, and decorations may communicate threat to people of color. So, so we went out of our way to make sure that we had artwork. Here's one example. I don't know if you can see it, but these are 3 women of different colors, right? To make the space feel inclusive. We had everybody in our treatment team give input on the decor, and everybody picked things from their own culture to include in the decor. This is a Tibetan sound bowl that we included. We had artwork of a framed print of a Latina mother holding her baby. We had an impressionist map of the world in multicolor. Jade beads, colorful cotton throws and pillows with patterns from India. So, so it was also it's also important not to be performative. So these were authentic because these were things that resonated with people on the team. And so that was the hope anyway. And then also, as part of this treatment includes music. No, a lot of treatments don't, but this one does. And typically as part of the treatment, when the person receives the MDMA as part of the therapy, they may, for part of the therapy, wear blindfolds and listen to music, right? And so there's a kind of a rule that it's going to be music without words, but a lot of times there's an assumption made that, well, if it doesn't have words, it's culture free. And that's not true, right? And so and so we know that the music is going to be an important piece of the treatment for this kind of therapy. And we have a lot of research to attest to that. But in terms of what exactly kind of music we're going to pick, well, again, we have to take cultural considerations, you know, into the space. So there had been really no research to guide us in terms of what are we going to do about the music to make it inclusive. But we know it, but we know it's important, and we know the typical playlist for these experiences is like new age music, space music, folk music, post rock, soundtrack music. And we're like, well, the people in our study, this might not be what they want. And, they may, and we could see that different music is needed to suit individual needs. And so we made a playlist for each person just based on the kind of music they liked. And it may include, it may be jazz, it may be gospel. I mean, I'm just thinking about things I like, but, maybe other stuff, right, that people like. And so, because it's so strongly connected to culture, it makes sense that music that's conducive to healing for white Americans may not be adequate for those from other cultural traditions. Also, we did trainings. Our whole team, we had regular trainings to make sure that we were all up to snuff in terms of our work with people of color. And you can see, even though we have a diverse team, you know what? Doesn't mean you got any training. Doesn't mean you got any training in diversity at all. Because you know what? Most training programs for mental health professionals or other medical professionals, they are catering to the needs of white people. And diversity is sometimes an afterthought. So we did our own training for our team. And of course, on the ground floor, you had to have a commitment to the mental health of people of color, and then make sure that they could operate in a culturally informed manner with the participants. And so again, not everybody had all the skills that they wanted or needed. And also, previous generations of clinicians may not have got any of diversity training at all. And so then you could be in a situation where you've got the most senior person on the team with the least, who are the least qualified actually to weigh in on how to do this kind of work. And so all of us completed the interdirected therapy that was required as part of the protocol for the study, but they also participated in other trainings. One of the trainings that we give is in functional analytic psychotherapy, which I love this approach because it's very much focused on the therapeutic relationship, but it's from a CBT perspective. So it's kind of speaks my language. And so it's one way that people can improve the therapeutic relationship and use that as a way to move therapy forward. And also therapists were educated on issues of bias and microaggressions so that they knew, what to look for. So we used a justice-oriented framework, and therapists created an environment of openness, curiosity, and validation to participants, and particularly when participants were talking about their experiences of racism. Therapists would express empathy for experiences of racism and marginalization. They would validate any mistrust in the research process. So participants might say, you know what, I feel like I need to do this, but I just don't trust you. And and I think in some cases, for some people, the knee-jerk reaction could be like, oh, you can trust us. We're not going to do anything bad, but we validate it. It's like, yeah, I get it. You got no reason to trust us. You don't know me. In your chair, I might not trust me either. So, and by validating their mistrust, that actually ironically makes people more trusting because they feel heard and they feel understood. And I know some clinicians were afraid to kind of validate the mistrust, but no, it's real. You have to validate it. And acknowledging, like, yeah, there have been abuses against people of color. There have been abuses against people like us for a long time. They're still going on. Hopefully you're not going to get abused here. I'm going to make sure of that to the best of my ability, but it's a real fear, right? And also cultural humility was underscored throughout, because it's really important that we don't get complacent and stop learning, because even if you know everything, even if you've got it all down, which nobody does, I don't have it all down. Things are changing, things are shifting, the language is changing, thoughts are changing, demographics are changing, different groups are migrating and or immigrating, and and so things that we thought we knew can even quickly become outdated. So we can't assume that we're competent. You have to approach clients with respectful openness and want to really understand who they are, and their identities. And so collecting demographic information is so important. And good researchers should collect all of this information from participants. And I think probably, most of you probably already collect it. In Canada, we're actually a little behind. They do not routinely collect information about race or ethnicity, which has made it very hard to do disparities research, actually. But but you know what? If you don't collect it, you can't do the research. You can't speak to how your treatment may or may not be effective for people in any of these groups, right?
Dr. Williams, how about we take a break or a quick pause here for
Yes.
questions? So yeah, why don't we open up the floor for some questions? You can type it into the chat screen and I'll read it out loud. So the new term, here's a question. The new term is culturally responsive, not culturally competent, to express exactly what you said. We can never know everything, but we can continue to strive to respond in a culturally sensitive way. Thank you for the comment, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. And you're absolutely right. So being culturally competent, that is an aspirational goal. We're never going to get there. You cannot be competent in a culture that you weren't born into, really. You can just approach competence. But I think it's worth saying, because that's where we want to be, but we're not there. So, so I think we can be culturally responsive, we can be culturally sensitive, we can be humble. We can be culturally informed. I don't know, maybe, at least try to be. So yes, to your point, I consider that an aspirational goal. Other comments?
Yes. So thank you very much for this informative webinar. Considering that some racial and ethnic groups are not recognized as distinct minority groups in terms of the US Census, such as Middle Eastern and North African communities grouped under white, which I want to make a comment on that. How can we move towards inclusion of these minority groups in research?
Yes, I love that question. So important. And this is why, in addition to collecting race, we also collect ethnic group. Sometimes people consider them the same, sometimes they're different. So, so we want to capture that from people as best we can. Also, I have some culturally informed demographic forms that I use, and if we have time, I'll show those to you. So you can see exactly how we collect the information to make it as relevant as possible, because we're basically collecting two things, right? We're collecting racial information, and race is a category people are put into based on their appearance and presumed ancestry, which may have nothing to do with how you feel or where you were born or even your actual heritage. And then we have ethnicity, which is a bit more complex and nuanced and more accurately reflects like who you are inside. And so you want to do your best to collect information on both of those, right? The person's their own ethnic identity and how they're racialized.
And I also want to comment the AMINA category is now put in place for the US Census, so that recently changed.
Yes,
so
good news.
now, how do we think about the compensation issue as it relates to unpaid student research assistants or internships?
Well, I mean, I personally, well, I think if the student is, actually doing real important work for the study, they should be paid. If it's primarily a learning experience, I mean, and I do have situations too, because I have research assistants, I have interns, I have practicum students, and also I run a business too. So, and when we bring in students, it's like we don't want to lose money, but often we are losing money. So I don't know, the way I see it is, and this is just my personal 2 cents, if they're actually contributing in a meaningful way that is resulting in either money coming in or grants coming in or moving the research forward, they should be paid. If it's primarily like, I'm training you and it's really just like there's nothing coming in for me, then I don't know that you could be paid. I mean, I can't pay you anyway. If somebody else can, that's great. But I think certainly people do need to be respected for the work that they do and their labor and what they contribute. And unfortunately, sometimes that is abused. And people say, oh, well, you're a trainee, so we're not going to pay you. And it's like, yeah, but I'm a postdoc. I have a PhD already. Pay me something. Come on. When I did my internship back in the day, I was an unpaid intern. And, even though I essentially had a PhD and was, diagnosing people in emergency rooms, right? Now, because of a lot of pushing around living wage, interns are being paid better. Like here in Canada, some of the interns, get like $60,000-$70,000 a year. And I'm like, man, that's progress. So, and I think they're worth it. And so, yeah.
Okay. And Dr. Williams, how many more slides do you have just to check?
I mean, I always have more than I need. So,
Okay. All right.
we can stop whenever and have questions.
Okay. Well, how about this one last question here? What are your thoughts about cultural humility and its role in research?
Oh, I think cultural humility is so important because if you go in thinking that you know everything, then you're gonna for sure miss things. And also you need cultural humility. This is where you really need it, is because you're gonna make mistakes. All of us are gonna make mistakes, right? Because there's groups that we don't understand fully. And in order to hear and understand that you've made a mistake and you need to do something differently, you have to have humility. And so you can't really grow without humility. So we all have to have it.
All right, Dr. Williams, let's turn it over back to you.
Okay, so I'll wrap up. So because this was a PTSD study, one of the things we wanted to look at was racial trauma, which is sort of a specific way PTSD can affect racialized people when they have trauma from experiences of racism. And most clinicians are not trained to identify racial trauma. And so, but we know that problems like police brutality, community violence, racism, poverty, incarceration can lead to traumatization. And it's going to be more likely to be traumatizing to people of color because they're more likely to have to deal with these problems. And lots of immigrants and refugees also may have PTSD from factors like ethnic cleansing and war, or torture, or difficult immigration experiences, or culturative stress, which are also things that are maybe not on the radar of a lot of clinicians. And so again, it's going to be important that and this is just for PTSD, but for any type of disorder that you're studying, you want to know, well, how is it going to look in the different populations that I want to include in my study? And it may not look the same as, what's in your DSM or what you learned in school. And so we brought on additional screening measures in order to assess some of these cultural constructs. So we used the UNREST, which is a structured interview for assessing racial trauma. And in fact, for the study coordinators, they wanted to actually use it at all their sites. And so we expanded it in order to be able to collect information, not just about trauma due to race and ethnicity, but other marginalized identities as well. And then there were problems that we didn't anticipate. Like, for example, everyone who came into the study, they had to be diagnosed by an independent rater. Well, the independent raters were not trained in racial trauma. And we're thinking most of the people we're going to bring in are going to have racial trauma. And these raters are the gatekeepers for the study. So, so we said, well, can we just make sure that, we have like our own independent rater and that person can rate our people? And we were told no, because the way it was set up with the FDA is it's going to be random from our pool of raters, by the way, all of whom were white, and at least half of them didn't have any training at all in working with people of color. So we're like, oh boy, what are we going to do now? So, and what we ended up doing was we just ended up training all of the independent raters for the whole study so that they could all learn how to assess for racial trauma. And that training process was intense. And they also needed more raters of color too. And so we were able to recommend a few because they weren't diverse at all. But, and I talk a little bit about the training process. I won't go into depth, but sometimes, and again, this is when you're kind of coming in on the back end of a study that wasn't set up to have, to consider these problems. You're going to have to sometimes go back and try to like backfill things. And then, and this is kind of the sad part of the story, actually. We met a lot of institutional resistance doing this study at the University of Connecticut. So despite assurances that our study would be welcomed, it actually wasn't, because there was a lot of fear around, oh my goodness, what if we get bad publicity that we're like bringing in like poor Black people with trauma and like giving them psychedelic drugs, and then something bad happens. So, so that ended up translating to like a lot of obstacles thrown in our way and not a lot of support for the work we did. And eventually, due to factors we did not have control over, the study had to close. So we did not proceed to phase 3. We had to end the study and unenroll people, and it was a bit traumatic, honestly, for all of us. So anyway, important considerations for participation and retention of people of color in clinical studies: diverse study staff, intentional training in cultural competence for therapists and raters, targeted outreach, meaningful incentives, validation of fear and misgivings, a comfortable setting, and competent assessment of target psychopathology. And in this case, it was racial trauma, and these are some of our team members. And I'll stop there for questions. Thank you.
Okay, so let's see here. We do have a question. As I advocate for people with disabilities, I am aware that many neurodivergent people do not identify as persons with disability. So I've been using disabled and neurodivergent people as a term to be intentionally inclusive. Does that land, or is there a better way of phrasing it?
Yeah, well, I think, hang on a minute, my window disappeared. I want to put up some resources for you guys too, but I think that because, when we talk about disabled people, there may be, people may automatically think about, oh, people with hearing disabilities or vision problems, or who are physically disabled in terms of getting around. And so I think it's sometimes useful to break those up and say, so that people know exactly who you're talking about. And I think it might be good to ask that, and, to get at disability in several different questions, where you're specifically asking about things like, hearing impaired, vision impaired, do you have problems with mobility? Do you have, are you neurodivergent? Because these are going to also require different kinds of accommodations as well. And I don't know that it's so useful to, lump them all together like that.
Okay, next question. How did you manage de-enrolling participants? I imagine that was a difficult process to go through on all sides and potentially disheartening for participants.
Yeah, it was hard. And, I mean, we did actually, one person made it through the study, and then the others we had to unenroll, and it was a struggle for everybody. I'm still a little traumatized from the whole thing, as you can tell. But we did offer people who were in the study, we offered them, like, I have an outpatient clinic, and so we offered them treatment there at no cost if they were willing, to get conventional treatment. And we were also able to offer ketamine-assisted therapy, which is legal, similar treatment to the MDMA-assisted therapy for people who are interested. And a few of them did take us up on getting the, hold on, I'm going to put, there we go, my contact information. Some of them did take us up on getting more care through my clinic, and then others didn't. But yeah, I mean, we wanted to do whatever we could to support people who had really journeyed with us and taken the big steps to enroll.
Well, Dr. Williams, I think the consensus from all of us is we feel very disheartened that the study closed. And in fact, I was just in some ways enraged that that happened because I mean, there's so much thought in everything that you did. I mean, just simple things. I mean, simple but small things such as even putting pictures of the team members, right? I remember when we were just getting some promotional materials reviewed through IRB, so much of it is text, and we base it on just what the template has been given to us. You know, we kind of just follow the old system of doing things without critically looking at, does this work for our existing population? Um, and again, you know, I really appreciate the wonderful talk and resources that you shared with us. And because this is recorded, we'll be posting this online. And give me all the participants who need CE credit, give me about 30 minutes. I'll send you the certificate information, and everyone will also get a program evaluation. If you can go ahead and complete that program evaluation, that way we can, in the future, the Multicultural Counseling Institute can have wonderful speakers like Dr. Williams. All right, everyone. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.